So I get a number of questions through my direct messaging thing on my Facebook about how I extend the life of the resin to be able to work on my own. Now I've got a couple of things I do. Firstly, I play with the catalyst from between 1.5% to 2%, depending on temperature, depending on the quantity I need to put down, and depending on how quickly I want to then continue to work over the surface that I've just done. If I want to come back after lunch, then I've got to jack up the catalyst a bit. Now, you never ever go above about 2 to 2.5% with polyesters and vinyl esters and gel coats, and there's a good reason for that, is that it can lead to premature catalysing and certainly lead to brittleness, and particularly with gel coat, it will certainly lead to more porosity, more little pinholes. You're exciting the molecules, you're getting the catalyst to work too fast, and what's happening there is it's going to separate off, and the pigment in the gel coat might separate from the gel coat itself. There's a lot of things can happen, and it's a pretty aggressive process, catalysing or cross-linking those resins. So another thing that I do is I actually purchase a slow release hardener in the MEKP that I'm using, which is the catalyst or the promoter that I use to set off my resins. Now, I buy normal release and I buy slow release, and when I'm doing a big job like this where I'm trying to lay out a 5 metre cross section over there that I'm about to do, I'll use a slow release in the spray gun, and what that will do is actually give me extra working time. There's no chance of that going off in the time that I'm going in an hour and a half. It's going to take me to lay, and that's a couple of things you can do. The other thing too is my gun is only delivering what I'm using at the time. I'm not mixing up a batch, and what I find is that most of the questions that I get asked are about pot life, and basically the pot life, once you add the promoter or the initiator into that resin, is going to be shortened the deeper it is. So if you keep it shallow, it means you're going to use it up quickly, and you're less likely to end up with a boiling mass of resin, an inch thick, that's going to start to exotherm and heat up and eventually go off, and ultimately that's just wasted resin. That's one of the key elements to the way that I'm building this boat, particularly with the gun system. I have this Graco gun, and I have this external mix gun. It only delivers resin that is catalysed. It's not something I have to mix up and then put through the gun system. Aids in cleanup, aids in delivery, aids in working time, and certainly has made my life a lot easier. I could not imagine having to mix up resin and do a job of this size. It just would. I'd need people mixing resin for me at all times. The slow release catalyst is actually noted as SR. You've got to be careful. It's only a tiny little notation on the bottle, but it does actually note that it is slow release. Great for use in summer, and particularly at the moment, I've still got 26 degrees Celsius today at the end of April. Now we're heading into winter here, so thinking about the temperature, thinking about the humidity. I mean, I don't start till 9 o'clock in the morning during those autumnal, winter and early spring months, because there's condensation in the air, and ultimately we end up with a less sort of favourable conditions for catalysing resin. I'll be the first to admit it, I'm getting old. I've been cutting composite cloth for around 25 years with giant hand shears, and I finally gave in to a pair of electric shears. These things are not cheap, but they certainly have been life-changing, particularly for the build of this deck. Cutting through 600 double bias with a pair of hand shears has certainly started to create some tendonitis issues in my elbow. I've got what they call golfer's elbow, which is actually the reverse of a tennis elbow, and it's starting to flare up the more and more I cut cloth. So finally succumbing to a pair of electric shears has been a life-changing thing for me during this build, and I'm able to sort of get through it a lot more effectively without any resultant pain at the end of the day. I don't use them on the chopped glass, on the chop matting or the CSM, because it is pretty brutal on the blades, and I certainly won't be using it on Kevlar either. I can use it on carbon and glass cloth up to about 600 without damaging the blades.
Righto, with all of this foam down now, I'm ready to laminate. Now the great thing about this 600 double bias, as I keep saying, is I can lay it out and get it all cut in, almost pleated and ready, just straight for laminating. And the nice thing about the foam is that it doesn't absorb a lot of resin, but these little perforations in them will soak up any excess resin. Now they already are 3/4 full with the sea light as they go up from the deck up from the laminate underneath, and then the resin on the top will actually fill the void and not leave any air bubbles. But the great thing about flat sheet is there isn't any air bubbles anyway, because you basically don't have any voids other than the gaps in between the pieces, which I'll fill with resin or with the sea light compound. But I've got my cloth here for all this forward deck. I'm going to lay out the 600 and get ready for laminating. I'll do it over here on this side. Okay, now that I've got my foam all done, first layer is 300 CSM. Now, there's a lot of conjecture about the use of this stuff across the industry, and a lot of it comes from the fact that boats are made with chopper guns and just basically chop fibre, sprayed, and then eventually a couple of layers of woven rovings. The advantage of this stuff is that it doesn't have a lot of strength, but it has sort of reinforcement or basic reinforcement all over in all directions, unlike a double bias that goes that way and that way. And it has maximum surface area for bonding, particularly things like foam and layers or laminates on top. So it would always go down on top of foam instead of straight 600 double bias. The 600, although it's a flat stitched fabric, will create small voids and have an increased amount of resin in the actual cloth that may not quite bond as well as this will. So this will emulsify onto the foam and end up with, you know, reasonable adhesion to the foam, or probably better than straight 600 double bias. But the advantage of it also is that it's a bulking agent, so I'm getting a little bit of thickness without a lot of weight. It's only 300 grams, unlike this is 600 grams a square metre. This being 300 plus resin will give me that slight bulk that I'm after, and then additionally, once the 600 is laminated into it, I'll end up with a far better adhesion to my foam and to my initial substrate.
So that first layer of 300 CSM that's actually bonded to the Divinycell H80 foam is hot coated on, and what hot coating means is you're actually jacking up the catalyst to 2 to 2.5%, increasing the catalyzing moment and providing a very, very good adhesive bond to the actual foam. It fills all of the pores within the foam, and also what's remaining of the perforations that the sea light hasn't actually come to the surface and grabbing that foam and pulling it down to the surface. Very important to note with flat sheet that it will actually yield a very low resin content because it doesn't have any voids to fill other than those small perforations. Grid score and cross-cut foam, such as I'm using on the remainder of the boat, actually will absorb a lot of resin. Well, it won't actually absorb the resin. What will happen is the resin will fill each and every slot and thereby add quite a lot of weight to the actual foam, although it's still far lighter than using any other substrate, possibly not as light as balsa wood. It will actually create quite a bit of weight in those cross-cut sections as the resin films and creates a blocking agent and actually securing the movement of the foam itself. One other thing to consider here with this laminate that I'm doing here, ultimately I'm going to roll peel ply onto every surface to finish the product. It also gives me a nice flat finish which doesn't require a lot of sanding, but the other benefit to me is that it leaves the surface covered with a covering and reduces any dirt or contamination. I see a lot of channels where people are ripping the peel ply off shortly after laminating. You should leave this stuff on as long as is humanly possible to protect the surface from any further contamination until the final bond is done. Although you can peel it off, and it's exciting to peel it off and get the feel for how it's going to look ultimately, I leave the peel ply on right down to the very last point that I can, and therefore it stops any further resin landing on it, it stops any dirt or grit that may be on people's shoes or whatever. It's just one of those things that's easier to leave it there and remove it just before you need to. It's such a great feeling to get that last layer of peel ply down, knowing that you don't have to worry about the exposure to the elements, to moisture or anything else until its final use is required.
Oh, that was a session. God, I stayed in gripping. It's only 23 degrees, but man, it feels like about 50 in this suit. That's now done. So the foredeck is now complete. This area in the midsection of the deck, which is actually as it slopes down from the windscreen down to the foredeck, actually has a slight curve to it, so I'm going to need to template it. There's also this large sort of what I'd call a hammerhead, scalloped hammerhead sort of look that needs to be templated as well. Now I need the foam as close to that curve as possible, like I did with this one here. The only real one way to do it is with a cardboard template and then take it up the factory, cut the foam, bring it down here, glue it down. Now of course it's going to be the grid scored foam, and it is actually bits and pieces obviously with slits in it. I don't want to bevel the edge of that on my saw because I'll lose too much material out of it. I'm better off doing it with my roller sander at a later date and just grinding it back. It'll take a bit of time to get that edge on it, but certainly it is possible. Rather than lose bits and pieces, I'll put the full sheets down and we'll go from there. But for first now I'm going to have to do this templating with the cardboard, and I'll go up and I've got to find the centre line of the boat, which is actually the centre of those hatches, and then I'm going to go put the first piece down, and then I'll go outwards from that. There's 5 sheets to go right across here, and they'll all be glued down hopefully by first thing tomorrow morning, and then I'm going to come in, I'm going to laminate that section, and then I'll continue on with foam and ultimately laminate this section. So I'm working in big stages now to get this complete. The whole foredeck now is complete apart from the anchor chase and a little bit of tidying up around those hatches. Now, having been lucky enough to score an amount of cross-cut foam, and cross-cut meaning that it's actually cut on both sides of the substrate, means that it'll actually flex in both directions. It has effectively been curved on both sides. By being able to score 20 sheets of this, I think I'm going to actually get my deck done. However, some of it was quite dirty. You'll notice there's some discoloration on several points of this cross-cut foam. Now, it's quite a simple process to remove the discoloration, as long as it's not a chemical contamination. If it were to have oil or degrease or anything sprayed on it, it simply wouldn't be usable as a substrate in a fiberglass boat, because you couldn't get a good chemical bond to the actual substrate. So I examined the stuff pretty carefully before I purchased it, and it is only a dust, and some of it is a little bit of sun fading. So it's simply a matter of giving it a good sand, and I'm able to reuse the product. It is very, very lucky to have been able to get it. Yeah, that'll be working. Just stand up there. It's filming. Have you got it filming? Yeah. I never know if John's filming or not. Righto, here we go. Got to get my roller out. Jesus. Get this shit absolutely everywhere. Tell me if it's lined up.
I can't tell you anything. Okay, up to the left. The left up. No, the left up, not the right.
The centre line's there. That's
Come
the
down a bit.
there.
You're going past the line. That'll do you.
Is that it?
Looks great.
Oh, no. Get my roller.
Bob's your uncle.
Oh, yeah. Got this stuff everywhere. Look at it. It's absolutely all over my knee pad. Freaking hell. I hate this shit. A bit of a stomp.
That's what you got to do when you're building a boat, mate.
It's a good feeling getting some foam down, mate, I'll tell you.
Coming to the end.
No.
Coming to the lift.
I'm coming to the end.
Another couple of weeks you'll be
great is that
lifting it out.
Conforming to the shape really well. That. Get the vibrator out in a sec. You're probably thinking it's quite a laborious process, but it actually moves quite quickly when you're laying large sheets of foam. Now, the Sea Light has a volume weight of around 40% of that of resin, so it's quite a light product. It's actually far lighter than resin would be. It is put on
quite liberally and then vibration rolled into the actual crevices of the cross-cut foam. The vibrating roller actually is owned by a boat builder 2 doors down from me, Vince Mackay from Cobia Boats, and he's graciously lent it to me on several occasions. This has a vibrating piston that is high pressure air controlled, and with a bit of extra weight on it, you can actually see the actual sea light oozing up through the cross-cut foam and thereby filling the void.
Get a bit dark in here. This is the last one for the night, so I'm a bit over it. I need to go home. Oh, and this is the dirty one, so I'm going to get him in place and call it a day. So this tomorrow morning when I come in, I'm going to sand this guy and get him all a little bit more presentable. Got to be a bit careful here if I stand on it, it's sliding down because it's quite a slope here. It's probably at about 20 degrees, this fore deck. Get my vibrator and I'm done.
Now, there was a couple of comments last week about the manky look of this Divinycell foam that I actually collected from Paul. Yes, it has got a few marks on it, and it's primarily a surface stain or a bit of weathering on the surface where it's actually been stored in the dust. So part of the next day was actually giving it a good sand and removing that top surface. Very important you don't use solvents or acetone or anything on it, but it certainly allowed me to proceed with a nicer looking foam. Now, I'm the first to admit it, I gave myself about a week to foam this deck. I think it actually took me 30 days in the long run. I gave myself 30 days to make the entire deck. I reckon I'm up to around about 60 odd days of work to complete the deck. And yeah, to actually hand shape and fit the foam into all these areas was a considerable effort. And I'm going to try to show you some of that as we go forward with the build.
So I'm down here on the beginning of the windowsill. Now this here that I'm sitting on here is actually the window insert, and this here is the foam core. Now this actually becomes a cosmetic part inside the boat. It'll be a faired and painted internal lining instead of having a separate lining on top of that. I intend to have this
nice and painted white, and obviously with Interlux or something like that. The issue I've got is that I need to blend a 10mm foam with this 25mm deck core, and I've got two choices. I can either butt it up like this and then sand it down, or over here you'll notice here, if I've sanded it flat, I can actually do this and then shape this one continuous shape all the way around rather than have it here, and it means that I can actually bring this forward and get this particular panel in line. I'm inclined to do this method rather than cut a rebate on the back of this and actually butt it up. I think that could be a problem and could create a bit of an unusual look inside. The idea is to have a perfectly shaped rounded edge here, and I can certainly affect that by doing this. It takes about 5 minutes to sand this flat all the way around, and basically that gives me the opportunity to then glue this grid score all the way down from here onto here, and that gives me one continuous glass laminate all the way from the foredeck down across the foam down into the windows, making it very, very strong. In fact, it's a bit like the chamfer panel I did up on the hull. If you have a look at the way that I did that, I actually butted it and rebated it and then spent countless hours sanding it. But I think this is the method that I'm going to go with here. It'll make it a lot easier for the sake of 5 or 10 minutes sanding to get all of these edges along here all the way around this section here sanded flat. And then the important thing is that as I go further around, it actually gets more complicated. So I think that's what I'm going to do, basically sand this flat and then buff that on, glue the foam down, and then I'll start to shape it. I can actually almost shape that with a block and start with the orbital and my conical, my rotational sander, my drum sander, and get that done. But they're now glued in place around here. That was a challenge getting that piece on, because that's actually not grid scored foam here. This is actually a flat sheet, but being 10mm, it conforms very nicely. You just got to put a lot of weight on it. But what I don't want to do is leave it too long. I want to make sure that I get some laminate on that pretty soon.
Now, as the old man grunts his way towards the end of yet another video, you can see me here employing my cardboard-aided design. I don't have the benefit of a CNC machine to cut this foam, and I'm also trying to be incredibly frugal with its use, as I don't have a lot of it and certainly won't have a lot to spare. In fact, I think I ended up with about 1 square metre of it left at the end of the deck build. So very, very important that I'm very careful with the patterning, and it has actually worked out really well. You'll notice I spend a lot of time on my knees, and I have been feeling it lately. And I just come back from a physio appointment about an hour ago before I edit this video for a knee issue that's certainly been created from this build. Now, I try to use knee pads as much as possible, but it's simply not possible with the amount of times I'm up and down. And as you can see here, I'm actually getting the templating pretty much done, and as I go into the next couple of episodes, you're going to see quite a lot of shaping and how I actually affected the seriously complex curves around the window mullions. And one of those things that really did delay the anticipated deck build time that I'd set aside in my mind. So don't forget to like and don't forget to subscribe. There's plenty more to come. I have a hell of a lot to come on this deck build, and I'm getting very, very excited to ultimately demold this boat.